Hi everybody, thank you for joining us. This is our third Free Speech Cafe that we're doing as part of our We Talk program here at the university. The purpose of the We Talk program is to help all of us learn how to have difficult conversations about a whole range of topics. But one of the topics that has come to the forefront for college campuses lately is free speech. So I am Jessica Swartz. I'm the Deputy General Counsel here at Western. I work in the Office of the General Counsel, and I will let the other panelists introduce themselves.
I'm Jennifer Townsend. I'm the Executive Assistant here at the Honors College, and I teach for the Department of Philosophy part-time a course called Seeing Things Differently. It's a course about understanding people across ideological and moral and political divides and helping them learn how to communicate with each other better.
Okay. And I am Dr. Candy McCorkle, and I serve as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion here at the university. And my job is to help us to understand how to appreciate and make room for all of our differences, as well as making sure everyone has an opportunity to engage and contribute to the development of our campus.
Great, thank you so much. So our first Free Speech Cafe was just kind of an overview of freedom of speech rights and where it comes from. Our most recent one, I know I'm missing one in the middle, I think, or is this the third? Either way, the last one we did was true threats, and how you can, when speech crosses over into true threat territory, that's when the government can come in and take action against it. Today we're talking about hate speech. And you know what we as the university are required to do or not required to do, and also different ways to approach it. So just to give a little bit of a historical and legal background on how this, how we have gotten to where we are and why we are here, you know, the underlying premise is that hate speech is free speech. Hate speech is protected speech, unless, and then there's a couple of check boxes under there for the unless. The free speech clause came about from it requires that the government not restrict speech. Okay, so it doesn't apply to private entities. It doesn't apply to individual citizens. It applies to the government. And in this situation, Western Michigan is the government. And so the government can only restrict speech if it has a narrowly tailored interest, or excuse me, a substantial interest in the reason for it, and whatever that limit is has to be narrowly tailored to that specific situation. So there's a couple of Supreme Court cases over the last 80 years that have informed where we are on this. The first one is the Brandenburg versus Ohio case, and that was from 1969. And in that case, there were some members of the Ku Klux Klan who were having a rally on their personal property, and they invited a news camera person to come and filmed it. And while they were there, these people, you know, started spewing their hate. And as part of that, they said, we are going to march on Washington, and from there, we are going to split up, and we're going to go to Florida, and we're going to go to Mississippi, and we're going to show these people that at that point they were arguing against or protesting against LBJ and Brown versus Board of Education, the anti-segregation cases, and said, you know, we're going to go, and you all better watch out, we're coming. So they got arrested for that, and it was for inciting violence. And then Ohio had a law that said you couldn't do this, you couldn't incite people to violence, specifically talking about political positions. And it went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, look, you, the state, cannot tell people what they can or cannot say based on their political position, unless you have a substantial interest or narrowly tailored. In this case, they said it's not reasonable. While it was threatening, generically threatening, they created this test where it says there has to be an imminent threat of lawless action. The speaker had to intend that this action was going to take place, and it was likely that this action was going to take place. And they said in this situation, it's not reasonable and it's not likely that anybody hearing what these people said really thought that they were going to march from Washington to Georgia and Mississippi, basically they used the word revengeance on all, and they were going against people of color and Jews throughout the thing. They said, yeah, this was bad, but it wasn't specific enough, and the government shutting this down wasn't specific enough, so this speech was protected. So that was kind of our first hate speech case, or in the 20th century. The next one, and this came several decades later, I'm not good at math, but like 35 years later, the Virginia cross burning cases. And so this was in 2003. And at the time, Virginia had a law on the books that said it's illegal to burn a cross, and just by the fact of burning a cross, you intended to intimidate. So actually, part one, it's illegal to burn a cross if you're trying to intimidate. Part two, doesn't matter why you burned the cross, just the fact that you did, we're going to find that that's intimidating in and of itself. So there were two different cases that came up kind of at the same time. One case was a leader of a KKK group, went to an outdoor property, private property. The owner said he could be there. It was in a field in middle of nowhere, Virginia. It said at the time there were about, over the course of an hour, maybe 40 or 50 cars drove by the road. This was, quite a ways off of the road. There were about 8 or 10 houses surrounding it, and one neighbor was watching it. And she said, I was watching it, I was hearing what they were saying, and then all of a sudden this cross caught on fire, and I was really scared. At the same time, so they brought him up and found him criminally, violated the criminal code for burning the cross. And the judge told the jury instruction is, doesn't matter why he did it per se, because he did it, it's intimidation, so keep that in mind. At the same time, there was a man who, he had just had a black family move in next door. And they had some kind of, discussion because he was doing target practice in the backyard, and the neighbor was angry about that. So the white neighbor decides that he is going to place a cross in the black family's yard and burn it right in front of them. Same thing, person was brought up under the same law, found that he violated the law. Well, both of these went up to the Supreme Court. And, the issue being, can the government say, we don't care why you did something? The fact that you did it in and of itself is illegal, and we're not going to let you do it. And what the Supreme Court did is they looked at the intent, because the statute said intent, and said, look, a cross burning, as reprehensible as it is, can either be a symbol of something, the way the KKK uses it at their rallies. Originally, way, way, way back, it was a symbol of from the Scottish clans that they used to call in their warriors when they were having battles coming up. Or it can be used to intimidate. And the Supreme Court said when it's the first one, that is symbolic speech. And that is expressing a value statement. And government, you can't step in, no matter how horrible this is, how hateful and degrading it is, when it's expressing a value statement, you can't limit that. Now, if you're going to take it and put it in somebody's front yard for the purpose of intimidating this individual family, now the government has a much stronger interest in making sure that its citizens feel safe, and that you can punish. So that was our second hate speech case. About 10 years after that, and it's just kind of ridiculous that we're still talking about this, but about 10 years after that, in 2011, there was the Westboro Baptist Church. And I don't know if any of you heard of them, but one of their values statements was against war and people who participated in war. However, what they would do in this particular case, there was a service member who was killed in the line of duty in Iraq by an IED, and they were having the service member's funeral. These people, the Westboro Baptist Church people, stood outside the funeral across the street on public property with signs that said, "Thank God for IEDs. thank God for dead soldiers, and thank God for 9/11. The father of the service member didn't see it at the time, but saw it on the news later that night. Filed a lawsuit against them for intentional infliction of emotional distress. It went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, again, and just so you guys know, these last two cases were 8-1 decisions with the Supreme Court. This was not an ideological split. This was all of the people, almost all, 8-1. I haven't read the dissent, or I have, but don't remember it. They said, this is horrible, but we have to protect this speech. If we don't protect this speech, who draws the line? Who decides what's hate speech and what's not? If I think something is horrible and hateful, but you don't, what right do I have to draw that line? And do you, the United States government, are we going to get involved in this? Okay, and from the beginning of our country, it has always been the government cannot limit your speech, except for footnote here. Most recently, and this was in 2017, Mattal v. Tam, T-A-M, also known as the Slants case. I'm not sure if you have heard of this, but this was brought under a provision of the Lanham Act, which has to do with trademarks. And there was a band of Asian American, or I think they're Asians, and they wanted to name their band the Slants, which is a derogatory term for Asians. The intent of the bandmates was to reclaim the phrase and to associate it with good things and strong things and that sort of thing. There was a provision in the patent law or the trademark law that said you cannot trademark something that's derogatory towards any group, individual, dead or alive, if anytime a substantial portion of them believes that it is derogatory. So they said, no, you can't trademark that name. It went up to the Supreme Court, and this rule was from the 40s, I think. It was in there and it had just never been taken out. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and again, I mean, it was a really short opinion for a Supreme Court opinion. If you ever read them, they're usually pages and pages and pages. This one was pretty short, and they just said, no, nothing in the last 70 years has changed our position on this. The government cannot make a value statement about the content of speech. So that is a real quick, in a nutshell, the basis here, the foundation that we have in the United States for why we don't let the government step in. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about, you know, the constitutional portion of that. And another issue also is, well, that's the First Amendment. Under the 14th Amendment, we all have equal protection, and under Title IX, an equal protection to education. So can you say, where do those two things interact? Okay, if there's someone at the flagpoles who's spewing hate speech, and a person of the group who is the recipient of that hate speech is saying, I can't focus on my classwork because I have to walk through this every day, does that person now, have we violated their equal protection? And how do those two things go together? So this is where I'm going to call in our panelists here, and I'm going to start with you, Jennifer. You know, how do we, from a free speech perspective, how do we protect free speech and protect equal access to education?
It's a difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that I have the definitive answer. But if we begin restricting speech, particularly on campuses, because students may be uncomfortable or offended or may feel threatened by what someone is saying, where do you draw the line? Because as you were saying earlier, you know, what's offensive to you may not be offensive to me, and vice versa. But if we take away any student's right to express anything that they want to say on campus, that rule can be applied to absolutely anyone, including minorities, including people who are feeling marginalized, including people who feel threatened in some way. And if they don't have the right to speak up, then nothing can be done about those feelings, and nothing can be done to resolve the environment that we're all here trying to educate in and learn in. And so for me, the response should always be to attempt a conversation with the person who is expressing these views. And that's what I teach my students. And I think that it's probably, it's not always going to go well. You're going to probably meet with people who are not interested in having a conversation with you more often than not. But if you attempt to say, why do you think this? Where does this belief come from for you? Why is this your perspective? Help me understand why you believe what you believe when you don't even know anything about me other than what I look like as I walk past you. And I know that a lot of people will see that as putting a heavy burden on the person experiencing those feelings. And I appreciate that and I understand it. But I see that as a fundamental way of diffusing hate in a peaceful way and in a way that doesn't restrict people's rights. And you know, I say you can always just walk away. That's easy enough to say, and I'm sure that most of us do that when we experience these situations, but it's probably not the ideal solution, and it shouldn't be the ideal solution. And I don't know how to convince people to be more open to conversation except to what I preach to my students and what I tell everyone I know. Everyone that you meet has something to teach you, even the people who are spewing hate at you. You can learn from that hate. You can learn what they're telling you. But you also have the opportunity to teach people in that situation. So as far as equal access, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that aspect of that question. For me, equal access is everyone has equal access to speech. Everyone has equal access to express their views. I don't know how to address how that might interfere with education exactly. Dr. McCorkle might be much better suited for that.
We have an expert in that here with us. So, you know, Candy, and again, recognizing the burden it often places on people who experience this to have to educate the rest of us. You are also an educator by profession, so we are grateful for you to be here. How can we balance or protect both free speech rights and the right to an equal education, equal access to an education?
Well, part of the problem is we're using the word equal, and it should be equitable, because giving everyone the same thing everyone doesn't need the same thing, and so that lies the problem.
Right. Just to put in it, the law says equal.
I know.
So
I know
that's
that.
why we do that.
But I said that's part of the problem.
Yep.
is how we use language often creates the problems we have because of how we use language. I think the first half of that question, and this was a quote that one of my graduate professors used all the time, and I loved it. Free speech begets more free speech. And that goes to Jennifer's point that if I begin to censor someone else, I'm also censoring myself, because what goes for them goes for. And so instead of saying, I want you to be quiet, instead, I can use my voice to give another perspective. Because oftentimes, you know, when we think about, you know, hate speech is free speech, you can play on words there. It's free speech in that it's protected, but it's not free. Because what it does is it takes away an individual's sense of safety. It can take away an individual's sense of identity, self-esteem. So there's a cost to it. There's also a cost to the person spewing hate speech, because the more they spew, the more they close their minds to learning new things. So it's not free when we think of cost. There's a cost to both sides to it. And I think the way we can do both is helping people to understand that I don't have to agree with everything that is said, but I want my right to speak, and I can't have that if I take yours. Then that nullifies both sides. When you look at, well, how does this apply to equal access to education? Well, if you think about education, you know, Jessica mentioned she does not good at math. I'm not crazy about math either. Organic chemistry was very hurtful to me, and I think I should be able to sue my organic chemistry professor. But my thing is, a lot of times we are uncomfortable. It's not to downplay that uncomfortableness, but it is challenging us then to figure out, how do I address this? How do I manage this? So having free speech does not eliminate someone's equal access to education, because just as they may say something hateful, doesn't mean you counteract with something equally hateful, but you can counteract with the opposite. And now they're uncomfortable. So that rule starts playing on both sides too. And so to say this group deserves more than that group gets us in a nasty conundrum. And it's looking at, how do we help each group learn to use their voice to express? I think the other thing is not having the person who is being oppressed or hurt by the hate speech necessarily be the one to engage in a conversation. This is where someone who's observing this, who also sees this as hate speech, even though it's not directed at them, this is where I challenge those individuals to speak up and not putting the burden on the person being attacked to speak up. And that's something we often do, say, well, you can, counteract. Well, think about it. If you are attacked by 3 people, yes, you might try to defend yourself, but the likelihood is very small because there's more of them than you. And so if you are the one being hurt or oppressed by the hate speech, that is where other people can step up and then talk. And that's kind of what We Talk is about, is helping people understand, how do I engage in these conversations? Even though it may not be about me, I still have an investment in it. Because again, if I want my speech protected, I want my equal access protected, then I now have an obligation to do that for someone else. And I think that's where we often forget about. We assume it's about the 2 people, the one hating and the one being hated. No, those of us who are spectators now have some accountability. Because if we allow that to happen, it's also impacting our right. And so if we want everyone to have equal rights, that's where we have to take the responsibility to step in and, not necessarily call people out, but engage people. And it is very hard. I think about in undergrad where I'm going to have you save a story because we're going to do later. Oh, I'm going to have people share stories. So I'm sure it's a fabulous story. I'm a storyteller. So yeah, I know. So we're going to move on. And Candy knows that, I love her and that I know that she likes to talk. So we're going to jump in there. And all of those are really excellent points. So, and we're going to talk about in a second, we need to allow hate speech. But are there things that we can do to make it so people don't feel like they need to have hateful speech, and don't need to do that? But in a minute, or right now, and I alluded to this to a second, there are certain times when the government can stop speech. So as an example, shortly after I started here, and we have this group come every year, there's a group of anti-abortion people who, they show very, very graphic videos of aborted fetuses. And regardless of where you stand on the choice spectrum, just seeing those images is horrendous, very, very, difficult to deal with. And we have a lot of, and of course it's part of their anti-choice message that they're sharing when they're doing this. When that happens, we get a lot of people in my office. Sorry, I'm touching the microphone. A lot of people in my office. I think Diane gets a lot of people in her office. She's the vice president of student affairs. The president gets a lot of people in his office. And the conversation on both sides of the issue. It's not just one side saying, make them stop. It's the other side. It's everybody saying, make them stop, regardless of where they are on the choice spectrum, as I'd like to call it. And we have to say, we're the government. We cannot. Do you really want the government telling you what you can and can't say? I mean, is that something that we as Americans feel like we're okay with? That being said, there are times when the government can step in. And one of them is what I had mentioned before with the Brandenburg versus Ohio, is the true threat. And when there is a true threat, and again, likelihood of imminent lawless action, incitement of the action, and the intent of the speaker for that to happen.
When those three things happen, now it's a balancing test, right? Usually the individual's free speech rights outweigh the government's rights to make them stop. When you hit those three things, now the government's rights start to outweigh the individual's rights because the government has a right in keeping its people safe. Say what you will, wherever you fall on President Trump, he has raised a lot of very, very interesting constitutional questions for those of us who study the Constitution. And one of them was January 6th. And his lawyers have made this defense. It's tied up at the very, very beginning of the litigation. But the defense being, this was free speech. We were speaking at the ellipse, and this other group of people took it of their own accord to go up and storm the Capitol. What we did was not incitement. It was not true threat. We did not intend for them to do that. So because of those things, our speech was protected here. It will be really interesting to see what the court does with that, because I think that's probably the closest case we've had of where this balancing test comes out. Most of the time the government loses. On this one, it's pretty close. So that's really interesting to see where that goes. And then a second one that has come up a lot recently is academic freedom. And you'll hear your faculty talk about this a lot. Last year, the Sixth Circuit Federal Court, which is the one we're subject to, made a decision about a school in Ohio. And this university in Ohio, there was a professor who had a student the student wanted to be referred to as a pronoun different than what the student presented as. And the professor says, no, I'm not going to do that. This class that I'm teaching, I use the Socratic method. It's a political theory, political science class, and not being able to use the Socratic method, meaning Mr. or Ms., referring to the students that way, will fundamentally alter my class. And the student said, or the teacher said, what if I just call you by your last name? I'm not going to use any pronoun at all. I'll just call you by your last name, but everybody else I'm going to call by by Mr. or Ms. And the student said, no, that's not good enough. Fast forward through the end of the semester, the student did really well, got great grades, participated in all of the classes. The professor still got disciplined because he violated the school's non-discrimination policy and gender pronoun policy. Well, it went up to the Sixth Circuit, and one of the things the Sixth Circuit said is the professor has free speech in their classroom protected by academic freedom. But that decision goes against everything that has come before then. Because historically, up until this case, and nobody has appealed it because nobody wants to go to the Supreme Court, up until this case, academic freedom is historically thought of as a professor can say what they need to say as long as it's germane to the topic that they're teaching. So if you are teaching a 19th century literature class, American literature class, and some of the books that you're teaching have the N-word in them because that's how they wrote in the 19th century, then the professor can, and whether it's a good choice, underlying all of this is just because you can doesn't mean you should, but that would arguably be protected by academic freedom because it's part of the class. It's part of what the education is that you're getting. Now, if you're in a chemistry class, and now the professor starts talking about, speaking on, lecturing about the defund the police movement, okay, that has nothing to do with chemistry. So that would not be, historically speaking, protected by academic freedom. I am drawing this as a very bright line. Many, many times it is not that bright of a line and it's hard to figure out. But that is another situation where a lot of people misunderstand where free speech and academic freedom, overlap and when the government can step in. But so one of the things that we're going to talk about next is nobody likes to hear hate speech. Nobody likes to be the subject of hate speech. I mean, we're going to share stories later about how we've experienced it. But what can we learn from hearing hate speech? Because there is something, as Jennifer was saying, there is something to learn, and Candy too. We've got a video from Van Jones. He is a law professor at Yale. He's also a commentator for CNN. This was filmed in 2007, I believe, at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is basically known as the gold standard when it comes to free speech on college campuses. What they say and what they do, a lot of schools, try to follow. And so we're going to listen to what he has to say about this question of safe spaces on campus.
Those who like bigots, pull his wrist.
But I'm going to say, I got tough talk for my liberal colleagues on these campuses. And they don't tend to like it, but they tend to like me, so I'm liberal. So I'm going to keep trying.
Let's test the promise.
Exactly. I want to push this. There are two ideas about safe spaces. One is a very good idea, and one is a terrible idea. The idea of being physically safe on campus, not being subjected to sexual harassment and physical abuse, or something like that, or being targeted specifically personally for some kind of hate speech, you are an N-word, whatever. That perfectly fine with that. Perfectly fine with that. But there's another view that is now, I think, ascendant, which I think is just a horrible view, which is that I need to be safe ideologically. I need to be safe emotionally. I just need to feel good all the time. And if someone says something that I don't like, that's a problem for everybody else within the administration. And I think that is a terrible idea for the following reason. I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I'm not going to take all the weights out of the gym. That's the whole point of the gym. This is the gym. You can't live on a campus where people say stuff you don't like. And these people can't fire you. They can't arrest you. They can't beat you up. They can just say stuff you don't like, and you get to say stuff back. And this you cannot bear. This is ridiculous BS. Liberals, my parents, and Monica Elizabeth Peake's parents, hello Monica, were marched. They dealt with fire hoses. They dealt with dogs. They dealt with beatings. You can't deal with a mean tweet. You are creating a kind of liberalism that the minute it crosses the street into the real world is not just useless, but obnoxious and dangerous. I want you to be offended every single day on this campus. I want you to be deeply aggrieved and offended and upset, and then to learn how to speak back. Because that's what we need from you in this community.
So that's what we're trying to do here with We Talk, is to make it so that we all learn how to have these conversations with each other. And ideally, we wouldn't have any more hate speech and we wouldn't need to deal with that, but we all know that's not going to happen. So what is the next best thing is to educate as many people as we can about how to handle these situations, and try to diffuse things and learn more about each other as individuals. So when we're talking about what can we learn from hearing hate speech on campus, I'm interested to hear what Jennifer and Candy about a difficult situation with hate speech. We'll start with Candy, maybe what you were going to say before, that you have experienced, and what did you learn? What could you have learned? What did you do? What did you wish you had done differently? Just share an experience.
I think this, I'm not going to use a story. I was going to use this one. I think is a better fit. Was as a sophomore in undergrad, I was sitting in my research and methods class. I was the only person of color in that class, and the professor stood up in front of the class and said directly to me, called me by name, and said, "You don't have the right to be here. You're the wrong gender, the wrong color, and the wrong socioeconomic background." And I'm thinking, you don't know my socioeconomic background, but okay. So I said, oh, well, okay. I said, well, you have a right to your opinion, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. And so I went to talk after the class to my boss, who was another psych professor who I worked for as a research and teaching assistant, and explained to him what happened in class. And I said, how do I grieve this? So we went and talked to the department chair. The professor was removed from the class, and another professor was brought in to teach the class for the rest of the semester. And that goes to your point about academic freedom. That had nothing to do with research methods. But I happen to be resourceful. But I also spoke up because I think about what happens to the next student in that class that may not be me, that happens to. And for that wonderful professor, when I got my master's, I sent him an invitation. I could not find him when I got my PhD because he was going to get a plane ticket. So he could see just what the person he said he couldn't do. But oftentimes when I have been in situations like that, I don't have a problem with speaking up to the person because I want to know, why do you think that? And so it's not much about me counteracting them, it's me wanting to get why. I want them to explain to me where this comes from. And most often they cannot. And that's where their argument begins to fall, and then where I can begin to fill in the pieces. But that's always my first question is, why do you think that? Where does that come from? Because again, the intention is to get you riled. And when you don't give the response, that also diffuses them because it's not going where I want you to go. And I think that's I often use humor. I think of one quick story. My son, when he was younger, showed pigs in 4-H, and we were the only chocolate chips that showed pigs. And his first time showing, we moved the pigs into the fairground, and I went to get something out of his tack box, and there were 2 older white farmers standing near his tack box. And they said, I can't believe they let in the fair, using the N-word. And me being sarcastic, I went over and I said, really, I've heard about them all my life. I've never seen one. Where are they? Because I wanted to challenge them to point to what they were saying. And they just kind of looked. I said, no, really, I've never seen one. I've heard about them my whole life. Where? Point it out. And they just kind of looked. And my son said, well, Mom, that wasn't very nice to say. I said, no, it wasn't very nice of them to say, but what we're going to make them do is to explain why they say it. If they don't, I said, what you're going to do is you're going to ignore that because you know that's not you. It's not what they call you, is what you answer to. But what you're going to show them is when you walk in that ring with that pig, that's where you're going to demonstrate your belonging. So we can waste energy and go back and forth, or we can do it another way. And there's different ways to do that. And so that's one of the things that I try to get people to do is, as he said here, you are not going to walk in the world and always be safe. You're not. You're going to hear things you don't like. You're going to see things you don't like. And if you want to live in a world like that, then I suggest stay in your room. And even there, you won't like it all the time because there's mirrors. And so my thing is learning how to separate what is true for you and what is not true for you. And just because someone says something doesn't make it true. Just because others believe it doesn't make it true. And so you have to learn, you have to do some emotional and some psychological working out. Because you're not going to walk through the world completely protected from things. Now, the place where you defend is when you're physically threatened. But just because someone says something to you, you have the choice to decide, do I waste the energy and engage, or is this something I can let go? But to walk around and have this sense that you have the right for everything to fit you, then we're going to have chaos, because we each can't have that, because what I want is not what Jennifer wants or what Jessica wants. But if yet we say that's what the world has to be, it's going to be chaotic. And so we have to learn how to begin to create spaces for ourselves. And so there's no such thing as a safe space, but there can be a brave or courageous space where you do step into uncomfortable environments, because in those environments you learn about other people and you learn about yourself. If we keep wanting everything to be nice and comfy, we do not grow, we stay stagnant. You need struggle and challenge to figure out what it is you believe, what it is that's true for you, so that you can go out and have a powerful voice.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Gosh, my stories will pale because Candy is funnier than I am. I think the word that comes to mind for me before I get into a story is resilience. And that's something that I think that has not been as focused on as we raise new generations of children, because the world has become a much more comfortable place for most of us. And so we haven't had to face a lot of genuine adversity, and so we lose that resilience. We lose that ability to go out in the world and put on a brave face until we feel brave. And in fact, my daughter said to me today before I came here that I always seem so confident, and I said, well, fake it till you make it. At least I have you fooled. For me, a story, you know, I've dealt with some hateful things on this campus, I'm sorry to say. Some of those things I've been called some names that I'm not going to repeat. I think most of the adversity I've faced is from a political perspective on campus, in that because this is a very, very liberal, in the modern sense, community, very progressive, people tend to see conservatives or libertarians or people more moderate or to right of center as the enemy or the other, and they're very comfortable with voicing their opinion on those people, whether they know those people personally or not. And what that effectively does is chill the speech of students who have those perspectives to right of center. And so they are afraid to speak up in class, they're afraid to offer a different opinion than their professor, and so frequently students will come to me and ask for my advice about what to do. And so what I did as an undergrad, and I will say I was a non-traditional student, so I probably was a little bit braver because I was a little bit older and had more life experience. You just have to speak up. You have to understand and recognize and realize and appreciate that your voice matters too, no matter who you are, no matter what your political beliefs, no matter what your personal beliefs. Your voice matters too. And it doesn't matter if you agree with your professors or if you are the only person in your class who varies from what everyone else is saying, and that has been me. You have to understand that you also have the right to speak up. And if you face retaliation from that, then there are avenues that you can take, because that's not okay, that's not acceptable. But it took me a long time to get there, and I think it takes everyone a long time to get there. When I was younger, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, people weren't quite as precious about language, I think, for good or for bad. I think it took a lot more for us to take offense back then, or to admit that we were offended because, oh, no, they were just joking or whatever. And so when you were genuinely offended by something, you didn't necessarily say anything. You didn't say, you know, if someone demeaned you because you were a woman, you were just like, I guess he's just a sexist pig or whatever. And it takes a lot of strength and courage and understanding who you are as a person to be able to start speaking up. And all I can say is keep trying.
Yeah, and I'll just echo, I mean, it takes practice, like lifting those weights. You know, that first time when someone says something to you and you're like, wait, did they just say that? Is that really what they just said? You know, and as you get more and more, you get stronger. and you can do it. But so talking about, there's a way to speak back that's not more hate speech. And so that's kind of where we're going with our last part here is, you know, how do we, what are some efforts that you guys have seen and that you guys have spearheaded, you all have spearheaded, to how to fight the hate speech with more speech? How you have taught students, your children, people in your communities, how you have taught them to speak back. And we are running up against time because we had all those IT issues.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. So just, you know, try to keep it brief, but don't feel like you have to censor yourself.
No pun intended.
Right, ironically.
Okay, I'll go. So I created a class specifically for, right now it's only available to honors students, but hopefully if we can get some more funding, I can open it up to everyone on campus. But that class is very specifically for teaching students, as I mentioned earlier, how to understand that just because someone disagrees with you doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong or that they're evil or that they need to be silenced. And I teach them I teach them conversational techniques, I teach them how to understand that it's okay to have conversations with people that you disagree with. You don't have to be embarrassed to be seen with people who disagree with you. You can have friends that don't agree with you. And by having those conversations and gaining understanding, and I make my students go out and have conversations with people on topics that they fundamentally disagree on. And so by having those conversations, what we're doing is fostering understanding, and we're making the world a tiny, at least in our tiny little corner, a little bit at a time, a more welcoming and open and diverse, viewpoint diverse, ideological diverse, physically diverse place, and that is only ever a good thing.
I think I have done similar things. We host in diversity and inclusion a series called Real Talk, where we have lots of different topics, and it's again to spark people to begin to come together to talk about different things that you don't normally talk about, so that there becomes a level of comfort with challenging yourself. As a professor, I used to always tell my students, you don't know your beliefs until you challenge them, and you can't challenge them until you sit down with someone who has a different one. And it's not about talking to convince somebody that you're right and they're wrong. It is talking to understand. I love to engage in conversations with people who are very different than me, because it helps me understand how they got to that thought. And if I understand how you got to that thought, then I know how to engage with you. It also helps me to check my own thoughts and my own beliefs. And so there's something that happens. And so I think with my children, I've always tried to expose them to things that are very different than what they're used to in their home, so that they, again, get used to existing in spaces that are not built for them, but still being able to be themselves. And so I try to challenge the students that way. I even, because I have this thing on my forehead, I guess, for people in Myers to come talk to me. And I will have people who are extremely conservative that come up to me and they express their views. And I don't shoot back and go, well, that's wrong. I go, well, and engage in the conversation. And they walk away never really knowing what my political ideology is, but at the same time not feeling like theirs was attacked. Because it helps me to understand, so that when I am presenting things to people, I can think about all the different perspectives and try to give information so that it hits those different perspectives. And then that allows people, if I can see myself in something, I'm more apt to engage. And that's part of the thing with getting people to appreciate diversity, is if they can see themselves, they're going to engage. If I cannot see myself, I'm going to fight against. And so trying to find a way to help people see themselves so that they will engage. And again, it's not about trying to change someone's beliefs or convert someone, but allowing, when we talk about inclusion, allowing space for people to enter the space as they are and still be equal contributors, and not, you can only be in the space if you think like this, or you look like this, or you act like that. No, create a space where we all can engage as who we are.
Thank you. So, and that's a perfect segue into the last little plug I'm going to make for our Irshad Manji in her book, Don't Label Me. She was here on campus, was that a month ago? And she's going to come back and do a lot of things with Kalamazoo and with our We Talk program. But reading this book really helped me. And I would strongly encourage it. And her whole point is to look at the individual in front of you. You can't say all Republicans are the same any more than you can say all women are the same, right? And so as we start to look at the individual, and rather than telling them what we think, ask them why they think what they think, we learn about them, we make them human, and that allows us to coexist with people who we may have diametrically opposed views with. But the more that we can coexist that way and look at each other as individuals, as other human beings, the less need there is for us to lift those hate speech weights, because we will start having these conversations.
There's a wonderful thing that I have a tattoo, and it says Ubuntu, which is a South African phrase that means I am seen because I see you. Once I give you humanity, I can't hate you. I can disagree with you, but I cannot hate you once I recognize your humanity, because in doing that, I've recognized my own.
So that the three of us could talk about this for
All day.
ever. But we would like to open it up for questions right now. If you have any, feel free to either shout them out or let us know who you want to answer it. We'll repeat them. And as you're thinking whether you want to do that or not, we also feel free to email any of us or reach out to the We Talk website. If you just Google WMISH We Talk, it'll come up and you'll be able to see our past cafes and our future programs. So does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah. Trigger words. That seems to be the thing right now. People talk about trigger words, and I think Van Jones kind of addressed it without using that phrase. But can you just talk a little bit about trigger words, because that is kind of in vogue right now.
Yes, right. So Dr. Anderson asked about trigger words and how that plays into all of this. So I'm going to let the educators kind of take over on that. Either one of you.
Well, and trigger words are people will use certain words that they think are going to get you going, like the N word is one, or for women there's a whole host. The B word is a big one. And the thing is goes back to, as I said earlier, that's done to bait you. And so you can be like a fish. You can either take the bait or not take the bait. And I would always say not take the bait. Instead, engage in a question. So if someone calls you the B word and you're a woman, you can say, well, why do you call me that? Or why are you using that? So again, making them explain what they're doing, and that they usually can't do that, and that gets them flustered. And then you can just simply say, well, my name is Mary, so I would prefer to be called Mary. But that's what the trigger words are. It's used to bait, so that I'm going to get you into an argument where you emotionally engage, and you're now not using reason or ration, and you're emotionally involved, and therefore I can kind of guide you wherever I want to guide you. And so that's what the trigger words are, along with the cancel culture that we have, which gets at exactly what we've been talking about, is you're canceled because I don't agree with what you think or say.
Jennifer, what do you?
One of the things that I stress to my students is that words have exactly the power that you allow them to have. And that's why the First Amendment is so important, and that's why people view it as so dangerous. As long as I can learn to control how I react to what people are saying to me, it diffuses what they're trying to do. So if you don't give them any power by reacting in the way that they want you to react, then they don't have any power. And their words don't mean anything.
And that's hard to do.
It's very hard to do. I will not say that I have not run to the bathroom and cried as soon as I've gotten out of a situation, because I'm human. I have feelings. Words hurt. There's no question. But as long as you allow others to see how much they're hurting you, you're allowing them to win.
But it's also just as painful to be baited.
Right.
I mean, that's emotional taxing to constantly allow yourself to be drawn into that. It is draining.
Yeah. Other questions? Well, we really appreciate you guys trucking over to camp over here to spend this afternoon with us, and we hope that you join us for more We Talk events. The video of this presentation should be online, I don't know when, in a couple days or so. And we have the next one is on the 24th. And what are we talking about at that one? I can't remember.
Crossing the line, the true threats.
Oh, the true threats. So we're going into more of the true threats, and we're going to be talking with hopefully a Kalamazoo police officer to kind of get his viewpoints on that, and some other community leaders. And so we hope that you join us and tune into other We Talk things and follow us on Instagram. Thank you. Have a good day.